This is in first month of January. So I wish everybody a very, very, very happy new year. Now, I'll call the names of all our chair and co-chair and speakers. They'll please take their seat. For first session, Chair Professor S.R. Bhatt, Chairman ICPR, I will request him to please come over the stage. He is already there, so please give a big applause. Co-chair is Mr. Harish Shah, Trustee, VVCRF. I'll request Mr. Harish Shah to come over on stage. Now, I'll call the names of speakers. Professor S.S. Ramarao Pappu, Professor of Philosophy, Emirates. I'll request him to please come and have a seat. Miami University, Oxford, Ohio, USA. So please, they are our guests and very good speakers. Let's give them a very good hand and applause. We all are fresh today and we have had our very good breakfast and high tea. So we should give a very good clapping. Now, I'll request Professor Mazina Yakuptak, Pediological University, Krakow, Poland, to please come and have her seat. We welcome her. Professor G. Mishra, former HOD Philosophy, Madras University. He is already there. Now, as you know, but for your kind information and little bit I'll brief it, that all the speakers will give their paper, they'll read their paper. Later on, we will have an open session. Then chair and co-chair will give their remarks and comments. So without wasting any time, let us start our proceeding. First of all, I will request Professor S.S. Ramarao Pappu to deliver his lecture.
This is a very, very long paper, which I will try to summarize in 15 minutes, the time that I have been given. I will just read the introduction, which says, I want to do three things here. In the first part, I will sketch the concept of a person in Western, especially liberal thought. Ever since Hobbes once discerns in the West an important tendency to conceive persons in terms of rights, the liberal tradition in the West maintains that it is the individual who is the possessor of rights, and the social order exists at best to protect the individual's rights. In the second part, I shall show that a person in the East, especially in India, China, is not conceived as a monad who enjoys his rights in isolation. Eastern thought doesn't use the rights language. It uses the obligations language. In the East, a person is conceived as an obligatory person, one who is essentially related to other persons, in fact, to the whole universe. Then in the third part, I shall compare the Eastern and Western perspectives on the concept of a person and show the inadequacies in both of them, and that a true concept of a person ought to include both rights and obligations. The concept of a person is one of the most discussed questions by philosophers both in the East and the West. There are many dimensions of understanding a person: the scientific, the metaphysical, the religious, the social, and so on. The concept of a person, according to common, there are two dimensions to this one: the scientific, metaphysical dimension, the physical, biological, self, soul on the one hand, and the ethico-social, legal conception on the other hand. But in common usage, we do not ordinarily have occasion to say Jones is a person unless there is some doubt whether the speaker is referring by the proper name Jones, his dog, his cat, or his chimpanzee, all of which are named Jones. This gives us a clue to one of the ordinary meanings of the word person, in that person negates, the concept of a person negates animals, things, objects, etc. One is a person in the biological sense if one belongs to the Homo sapiens. There is also in common usage a moral, social, legal concept of person. In this sense, for example, in the past feminist movements, civil rights movements, etc. in the West, when banners like blacks are persons too or women are persons too, the reference of the word person is not to Homo sapiens but to the ethico-social legal conception. An individual may be a person in the biological sense, but may not be considered a person in the ethico-social sense, for example. So that the concept of a person negates vegetables, newly born people, and so on and so forth, I will omit the lot of development of this concept of a person, in Aristotelian terms and Kantian terms and so on. And especially the notion of a concept of a person becomes very prominent after Hobbes and later on with Locke. Locke, like Hobbes, postulated that people can possess in other words, who is a person? Person is that kind of a belong to the Homo sapiens who is the possessor of certain kinds of rights. It is what natural rights which define the concept of a person. According to Locke, the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obligates everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, and so on. It is the individual, according to Locke, who is the possessor of these rights, and he has thus set in motion what C.B. Macpherson of University of Toronto called the political theory of possessive individualism. So man is a possessor by nature, of so many of natural rights. These natural rights are inalienable, and they cannot admit of any exceptions. And the Lockean natural rights to life, health, liberty, or possession are what may be called negative rights, in that they don't enjoin others to positively do something and so on. Anyway, I will skip off a lot of this kind of characterization of the rights theory and so on. And the Lockean natural rights doctrine, therefore, should be considered a revolution and not another version of the natural law tradition. It was a revolution because the natural rights theories no longer talk about the central theme of the natural law tradition, like the universality and immutability of physical order and so on, and divine reason and so on. Anyway, skip off a couple of other pages. What then? So the modern conception of human rights, again, especially the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is not another natural rights doctrine with the mere change of name from natural rights to human rights. There are important differences between the natural rights and the human rights doctrines. And what are these human rights, It is generally agreed that a right is a human right if it possesses the following characteristics. Number one, all and only humans have them. Two, all humans share them equally. Three, human rights are not derived from any other status. And four, human rights can be claimed against or from all persons and institutions. So, what is important to note is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights also is the contention that human beings can possess these rights simply by virtue of their being human, and they can be claimed against or from all human persons and institutions. So it is the individual who is the possessor of these rights. Social institutions and other human persons are there against whom one claims his rights. So much a summary of the rights tradition in the West. Now I come to the Asian traditions. When Julian Huxley, the former Director General of UNESCO, requested Mahatma Gandhi's views on human rights, he first published in 1948 a volume called Human Rights. The first shot was given to Mahatma Gandhi. Only one page he wrote on the human rights. So So this is what Gandhi wrote on human rights. I learned from my illiterate but wise mother that all rights to be deserved and preserved came from duties well done. Thus, the very right to live accrues to us only when we do the duty of citizenship of the world. From this one fundamental statement, perhaps it is easy enough to define the duties of man and woman and correlate every right to some corresponding duty to be first performed. Every other right can be shown to be a usurpation hardly worth fighting for. In fact, the first sentence Mahatma Gandhi wrote, there are no human rights. For a human rights volume, that Julian Huxley exempted. So the above reply from Gandhi may come as a surprise to the modern Western thinkers, but to the Eastern mind, there is nothing startling about this position. Chung-Shu Lo, the Chinese thinker, for example, points out, with regard to the Chinese thought, that, quote, the basic ethical concept of Chinese social political relations is the fulfillment of the duty to one's neighbor rather than the claiming of rights. The idea of mutual obligations is regarded as the fundamental teaching of Confucianism. John C.H. Wu likewise says, quote, the outstanding characteristic of the legal system of the old China is that it is a system of duties rather than rights. Why is it that Eastern thought takes obligations and not rights as the primary category of their ethico-social political thought? First, Eastern thought doesn't have the equivalent for the English word right. In Sanskrit, for example, the nearest equivalent of the term right is yukta or uchita, which is appropriate, or nyayata, just, or dharma, obligation, adhikara, or entitlement. But none of these terms capture the essence of the modern concept of a right. In other words, we just don't have a word in all our history, something which corresponds to the modern concept of a right in the Western tradition. In Chinese language, likewise, right is translated into two words, quan and li, which means power and interest. Second, Eastern thought seems to realize that rights talk is not significant unless there is first the acceptance of obligations to respect others' rights. Some commitment of the form, quote, I or we accept the obligations to respect others' rights is a precondition for the fulfillment of others' rights. Where there is no acceptance of obligations, talking about rights will be merely making claims with no hope of reconciliation. If you don't feel obligation, then what is the point of my claiming a right? That's why the obligations are important. In fact, in the East, the process of maturation of a human being into a person is conceived of as consisting not in the claiming of rights, but in the progressive assumption of obligations to others, whether or not others claim their rights or not. A child, for example, first develops a sense of obligation towards his parents, brothers, sisters, before he realizes or claims that they may have rights against him, or that he has obligations to them because they have rights against him. Anyway. Third, unlike the Western liberal individualism, a person is never conceived in the East as an isolated monad who enjoys his rights in isolation. In the East, the individual is one who is essentially related to other persons, in fact, to the whole universe. And the relationship between persons is conceived in terms of mutual obligations. In Confucian thought, for example, the basic social relations which entail mutual obligations are the relations between 1, rulers and the subjects, 2, parents and children, 3, husband and wife, 4, older and younger brother, and 5, friend and friend. In Indian thought, likewise, the concept of a person, of a man, is the concept of a dharmic person, or an obligatory man, if you can call it. To be a person is to incur certain runas, or debts. In fact, the word coined is runa, not dharma is. Runa means that is a kind of a deeper obligation, and to be in a dharmic relationship with other persons. Some of the dharmas or obligations of man are sadharana dharmas, obligations pertaining to man as such towards himself and others, vishesha dharmas, relative obligations, and so on. Manu, the great Indian lawgiver, for example, includes asteya, Satya, Sadharana Dharmas, and the obligations pertaining to the four castes, Varna Dharma, and the four orders of life, Ashrama Dharma, as Vishesha Dharmas. The point to be noted here is that to be born as a person, according to the Indian thought, is to be born into a station in life, to be in essential relationship with others, and thereby to incur essential obligations to others. A fourth and important reason why Eastern thought is obligation-oriented and never raised the right stock is the built-in safeguards in its socio-political structure against tyranny. In the West, philosophical theories have been advanced sometimes to justify an absolute sovereignty of the state against the citizen and sometimes a limited sovereignty. Some of the human rights theories could be considered to be the revolt against the absolute sovereignty of the states. Those who justified absolute sovereignty in the West sometimes appeal to the divine right of kings. The emperor is the lex animate in terris and incarnation of the law on earth. Others appeal to the fact that the individual in the original contract gave up all his rights to a person or a body of persons and therefore lost all his rights, and therefore the sovereign is the supreme. John Austin in recent times and Hans Kelsen, the great jurist, showed the conceptual impossibility of a political sovereign being limited. To say that somebody is a sovereign, but limited sovereignty is a contradiction in terms, for many legal theories. Indian political thought, on the other hand, did not even develop the theory of absolute sovereignty where the sovereign, whether an individual or a group, is above the law. The Samrat or Chakravartin holding the Shweta Chhatra or the white umbrella no doubt symbolizes sovereignty, but the sovereignty of the emperor is more symbolic than real. The limitations of the Indian sovereign are not de facto. That is, they are de jure, or limitations imposed by Dharma. Dharma tells who is to govern. One must be Kshatriya and so on. Laws of succession, the theory of election of king in Vedic times. What the sovereign must do, he must protect dharmas. When he is transgressing dharma, and what should be done when one transgresses the dharma. Dharma does not give rights to the sovereign. It only imposes obligations on him. Rajadharma is not a manifesto of the rights of kings. It is a charter of their obligations. As Daniel H.H. Ingalls, the great Sanskritist, points out, the great virtue of the religious legal tradition of India was that it caused the state to interfere as little as possible with the individual. I'm quoting Ingalls. In most of the affairs, the individual was guided and judged by his neighbors, his caste brotherhood, his village council or headman. Only in his dealings with his outside world was he subject to the king's laws as interpreted by the king's pundits. As John Mayne, the exponent of the Anglo-Indian law, puts it in the mouth of the village informant, we observe our own rules. Where there is no rule, we seek the advice of the pundits. That's it. Okay? How many?
15 minutes away.
Huh?
You have 15 minutes are over.
Over? Okay. Anyway, the upshot of the discussion simply is the following. In the East, it is not the case that persons are conceived in terms of rights, nor are they defined in terms of both rights and obligations. Anyway, the one thing I want to conclude is actually, what is it to live in a world where there are only rights and no obligations, and what it is like to live in the world of obligations with no rights. For example, one of the modern conflicts of the modern Indian social and legal system is this. The Constitution does not take into account 3,000 years of tradition of dharmic laws, obligations. It doesn't recognize any obligations on the part of that one. So, P.V. Kane, the great Dharmashastra person, he says, the Constitution makes a complete break with our traditional ideas. The Constitution engenders a feeling among common people that they have rights and no obligations. and that the masses have the right to impose their will and to give the force of law and justice to their own ideas and norms formed in their own cottages and tea shops. I'm mentioning the word tea shops here. Okay. The Constitution of India has no chapter on the duties of the people to the contrary or to the people as a whole. So, with the result, actually, what is typically happening is the modern conflicts of the Indian system is people think we only have rights, we have no obligations to anybody. So, suppose with the result, actually, what we really need is a correction in our the holism comes here. If you live only in the world of obligations, suppose the king doesn't perform his obligations, you have nothing to do. You are powerless. On the other hand, we are now living in the world of rights. Therefore, there is always so much of a social conflict. You don't know. Nobody has any obligation to anybody. So what P.V. Kane says, for example, what is law, what is dharma, what the people in the tea shop talk about and impose that one on the society. So what we really need is to go beyond these rights doctrines and the obligations doctrine into something what the theme of the seminar, namely a holistic conception of these rights and duties, which is beyond rights and beyond obligations. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rama Rao Pappu. But we are very sorry that you had to cut short your paper. Hope you will bear with us. Now I request our second speaker. Please welcome Professor Mazina Yakub Tuck. I'll invite her. She is Pedagogical University, Krakow, Poland, Professor of Philo. Now we will listen to her. Please give a big hand.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk about the agency in the context of classical Samkhya and yoga philosophy. So it's in a way narrow, but on the other hand, it can be also extrapolated, I hope, much wider. The problem of psychophysical agency provokes numerous questions. Here I'm going to focus only on some basic issues to expose the view of Samkhya and yoga, two closely related philosophical schools emerged in ancient India. The questions to be considered in the context of these two classical Hindu darshanas are as follows. What is action in terms of Samkhya Karika and Yoga Sutra? Whose action is it? Or what makes one an agent? What is a right act and morally good action according to Samkhya and Yoga? And how free is our will? When seeking the answers to these questions, I argue that agency, as it is conceptualized by philosophical tradition, being the subject matter of this paper, should not be identified with personhood or selfhood. Neither it ought to be motivated by the expected results of one's actions. My claim is that what challenges the Samkhya Yoga philosophical perspective on action is empowering agency by revealing the agent's determinants and by imprinting the agent's... So my claim, once again, sorry for interruption, is that the focus of Samkhya and Yoga is empowering agency and also some kind of imprinting is what is the focus of these philosophical perspectives. Imprinting in agent's mind the right perceptual modes and behavioral procedures. These right modes and procedures are to prevent the self from being identified with ego or current doer, and to liberate the self from the illusionary engagement in so-called voluntary action. Before I focus on Samkhya and Yoga, let me first refer to some basic distinctions made in the contemporary philosophy of mind. It will be helpful in situating the Indian view and will allow us to capture the specificity specificity of Samkhya and Yoga view in contrast to the popular Western conceptualization. A central question in the philosophy of action in contemporary Western view is what distinguishes human actions from events or doings in general. A standard answer to this inquiry appeals to a causal theory of action. Genuine actions or deeds are said to be deliberately done or undertaken to bring about some change in the world. They are events with a distinctive internal cause, such as intention, volition, belief, or desire, whereas other events that merely happen to us, such as raining, sweeping down, or snoring, do not fall into the category of action because they are not caused by suitable intentions or desires of the agents. When we look closer to the concept of action as it is exposed in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and in Samkhya-Karika of Ishvara Krishna, we can find no clear distinction between human intentional doings. We can find no clear distinction between human intentional doings and events that merely happen. But instead, we come across quite a different categorization, indicating a variant approach. The fundamental category in this context is transformation, parinama, covering both the human actions and all worldly events or happenings in general. Samkhya Yoga tradition develops the doctrine of world-nature transformation as the unified conception of change and grounds it in a general assumption that there is no essential or ontological difference between these two kinds of doings, because both human actions and any worldly events undergo the same kind of natural triguna conditioning. In his commentary to Yoga Sutra, Vyasa claims that every change is in fact nothing but transformation of qualities, dharmas, which are always inherent in substratum of qualities, dharmin, both in the knowable and the knower, and does not affect the substance, dravya itself. The change of dharmas may be threefold. One, it can stand for succession of essential qualities of a substance, dharma parinama. Second, it can refer to the sequence of the temporal qualities within a particular owner of the properties, dharmin, lakshana parinama. And three, it can also mean the change of state of intensity of the present quality, avastha parinama. Thus, every change, including human intentional doing, results in the change of properties, dharmas, which are modified only in the sense of changing their mode of existence, bhava. What is more, every change, according to Ishvara Krishna, undergoes the universal principle of causation called satkarya, where the effect is inherent in the cause, and it exists even before the causal operation. In other words, action brings to existence what has potentially existed since ever, and not only after the particular agent came about to desire something or even came into actual being. Therefore, no action can result in something what is of different essence as its cause, because action is only to transform the unmanifest avyakta into the manifest vyakta. However, this very broad sense of activity or doing as a pervasive change, parinama, being just the manifestation of a thing's previously latent properties, including, for example, involuntary falling a stone to the river, as well as my intentional throwing a stone at a person, is definitely not sufficient when it comes to discussion on the moral issues. This kind of agency, kartritva, implying a capacity for reflection and choice, brings an additional context to the causal relationship, which is in all the classical schools of Indian philosophy, both Hindu, Buddhist, and Jaina, captured by the notion of karma. And I'm not going to develop this further, of course, at this point. I'm going to focus on the question, who is the agent now? What seems necessary for the agent is the entity being capable of action which undergoes normative evaluation and is assessed as correct or incorrect, good or wrong, is the capacity to act voluntarily and take responsibility for one's deeds. As far as volition is concerned, yoga thinkers argue that any voluntary act or conscious intention, when translated into action, turns immediately into involuntary factor of the future action, being recorded as a latent impression, samskara, and then arises spontaneously as thoughts or fluctuations of mind, chitta vritti, to give an impulse to another desire, intention, and then action, which will be inevitably preserved as a subsequent samskara of the same kind to become an impulse of, and so forth and so on. This is how Patanjali explains inescapable limitation of agency caused by the constant interaction between the conscious and voluntary acts on the one hand, and the subconscious inclinations, habitual behaviors, instinctive or automatic activities on the other hand. In the light of the conception of mutual conditioning between the actual doings and their latent imprints, which stands for, at the same time, a cause of effect and a cause and effect of one's volitions, the concept of free will seems rather thin, because even the most intimate desires, raga, and aversions, dvesha, are virtually conditioned, if not determined, by our previous actions, bringing fruits in the form of seemingly spontaneous wishes motivating our action. We should not overemphasize the sovereignty of volition in describing the nature of agency. In our will can hardly be considered free as long as our voluntary choice and the active decision is determined by the latent trace of our previous actions, samskaras, in the form of our likings, aversions, desires, fears, perceptual and behavioral attitudes, etc. In other words, will is never fully or really free before one can be liberated from the karmic inheritance of the past deeds. And this may only be achieved by eradicating of ignorance, avidya, about the ultimate nature of reality, including the mechanism of human agency. This liberation from the past determinants of our own activity is identified by the Samkhya and Yoga thinkers with the final spiritual goal called kaivalya, that is oneness, the perfect isolation or emancipation, which implies detachment from all samskaric involvement and the natural trigonic conditioning. Having achieved this purpose, no fruit of action is desired by the agent anymore. Therefore, what seems more important is to figure out why I actually wish what I wish, rather than how to achieve what I want. And yeah, because time is nearly consumed, right? I would like to just to read the conclusion, which is not fully supported by the arguments due to the time limit. Anyway, what challenges the Samkhya Yoga philosophy of action is empowering of agency by displaying the agent's determinants and by imprinting in the agent's mind the right perceptual and behavioral procedures, which prevent the self, purusha or chit, from being identified with the ego, aham or chitta, or current doer, and from engaging oneself in ownership of voluntary action. However, the key problem seems to arise right here. How should such a right action be accomplished, since there are two opposite tendencies within a human being? This dilemma is solved by subordination of action to insightful perception. Both classical darshanas, Samkhya and Yoga, recognize a strict correlation between liberation and true knowledge. The knowledge of the inner subjective conditioning, including the subconscious latent factors or motivators, rather than the external circumstances or doings. Only having captured the mechanism of self-conditioning by own actions, one can start modifying the burdensome nature of doing. The crucial task is to decondition one's action or to transform its causal chains so that the agent may shift to a different perceptual procedure, thanks to the meditative mode of consciousness, and in consequence to endure in the right behavioral procedure based on the non-egotist perspective. Those, yes, I know, last sentence. Though this is the empirical ego, aham, who is the agent till ignorance is ultimately overcome. Its action should become less and less focused on minus, mamakara, of one's will, but instead, so to say, more automatic or ritual-like. We could also call such a satisfactory right action ignorance and doubt-free of, or egolessly, spontaneous, effortless, and dispensable. So this is the perspective of these two classical schools that I very, very briefly underlined here. Sorry for these shortcuts. I hope that maybe in questions or comments we can develop some points a bit in depth. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We were listening to Professor Mazina Yakupczak, Professor of Philosophy, Pedagogical University, Krakow, Poland. And sometimes when on the spot we have to edit a script, we might have missed something very important. But hope you will excuse us.